Working the night shift as a waitress at a roadside diner was never exactly the goal for me. No matter how much you plan ahead, no matter how careful you are with the choices you make, and no matter how good a person you think you are, you're ultimately left at the mercy of the whims of fate. Life's like a bull. When it starts as a wild, untamed bucking, you can either hold on for dear life or fly off and end up in a load of bullshit. You can guess which way I went. I knew the owner of a diner from way back. He was an old friend of mine. He saw I was in a bad way and gave me a job, despite a pretty huge gap in my resume and a total lack of experience. I was grateful, but honestly, it wasn't ideal. The location was a little joint, was so far into the vast nothingness of the desert, it felt like the entirety of civilization was years away. The drive to work each day felt like a never-ending journey into a lost world that only a handful of human beings knew about. I felt like I could sit there and stare at the wall for hours on end, and not a damn thing would change around me except for the amount of flies that buzzed in through the windows, or the amount of dust and dirt that would sweep in under the cracks at the doors. I grew accustomed to the familiar crackle of the small, cheap radio set on the countertop. It felt like my only connection to real people. My eyes adjusted to the blinding fluorescent lights that decorated the ceiling, only juxtaposed by the dim street lamps that barely lit the ground outside. The only thing to look out the windows of, besides a sea of brown dust and sand for miles, was a dingy little bus stop. The buses always drove straight past our doors. No one ever stopped there. To top it all off, I was forced to work the night shift. The owner decided he wanted to go with the 24-hour approach, to complete with the whole big name diners you see in the city. He hired a lot of young ladies, high schoolers, trying to earn some more spending money, and all they had to do was work the day shifts. Lucky me, a single woman in her 50s, didn't really change or have much to do during the day anyway. So he stuck me in the AM shift and even had me, quote, a person in charge. I guess it wasn't always so bad. I could listen to the radio in peace while I set up for everything for the morning girls. I'd restock the back, fill the condiments, clean the dishes, and sweep the floors. This particular night, I had sent the cook home. We hadn't seen a customer since 10 p.m., and I had worked long enough to know where I knew how to cook everything on our limited menu anyway. Now it was 2:06 a.m. I was listening to some station that called themselves the Night Owl Hideaway, while I cleaned off all the table stain menus. The fluorescent bulbs hummed like always. The radio crackled at every syllable. It was ordinary. That was, until some young woman arrived. I saw her coming from a mile away. Out the windows, we could see the horizon. She was walking down the dirt road at a pace I could only describe as hurried, but slow all at once. Her right hand clutched her forearm and never once let go. Absent-mindedly, I wondered if she'd stop into our place. She made it all the way to the bus stop and stared up at its sign, squinting like she was trying to read. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't staring at her, but I couldn't help it. Her skin was tinted in a natural shade of gray, pink, and she stood so thin I could swear I could see her ribs poking out of the sides of her tainted dress. She had worn down her sneakers coated in thick layers of dirt and mud. The purse draped over her right shoulder had a giant hole in the bottom. In all honesty, I wanted her to come in and ask some questions, but I'd rather keep on walking and leave him be. Sure enough, after she squinted at the sign, she hurriedly walked into our front doors. I awkwardly got out the booth, and I had rested in and settled down in my skirt and apron. Before I could even get a word out, she was already speaking. Excuse me, do you know when the next bus runs? Yeah, I don't think it comes till about 3:30. They don't run as often in the AM, I said, trying to stare so obviously at her. I set down my menus and heard her let out a noise, almost like a mixture of a groan and a whimper, her eyes darting back from me to the front door. And the next stop, do you know how far that is? Probably not for at least another mile, but not entirely sure. The woman nodded her head, looking like she was fully expecting the disappointment she got. She let out a few shaky breaths as she adjusted her purse on her arm. Alright, then I'll just have to keep going. Thank you, ma'am. She turned and reached for the front door, but something made me stop her. Wait, miss, I said, rounding the corner and walking towards her. Are you alright? You don't look so good. Can I get you anything? I'm sorry, I don't have any money, she said quietly, almost on cue. I heard her stomach growling something fierce and watched as she turned away to hide her face from me. I'm sorry, I really need to go. Come and eat, miss. It's on the house. Don't worry about it, I said pleadingly. Something about her emaciated form hit my soul. I couldn't stand watching a young, broken girl walk out those doors hungry and alone. Her whole being froze for a moment thinking about my offer. She shuffled her feet away awkwardly and turned to look back at me. Are you sure? I really don't have anything to pay you back with. I don't want to cause any trouble. I smiled at her as warmly as I could, trying to put her at ease at least. It's no trouble at all, hon. Now come on, come sit and look at the menu. I'll fix something up, whatever you'd like. For a moment, it really looked like she'd book it straight out the door and run as fast as she could. Her small form was shaking every so often. Her stomach would rumble again. I think the only reason she stayed was because she physically couldn't handle the hunger pains anymore. She nodded uncertainly and shuffled over to the countertop. She was so small and delicate. It looked like she struggled to get onto the high top seat. Looking down at the menu, her eyes rocked over every single thing at least 100 times. And I could have sworn her mouth started drooling. She ordered very politely and quietly and said nothing else. She just crossed her hands in her lap and stared down at the countertop. I can't stay long, she called to me as I cooked in the kitchen. Really, I can't. I need to get going. What's got you in a hurry? I asked. The young woman took a long time to answer. I peeked my head through the kitchen window and saw her mouth forming the shapes with no words coming out. She closed her eyes tightly and hung her head in shame. I'm being followed, she finally got out, in a clearly pained tone. I have been for a while, and I need to keep going. I only stopped because I feel like I got enough of a head start. And at the sound of her, I went silent. I wasn't sure what to say to that. Did I comfort her? Did I try to help? Did I really want to get involved? It may sound so selfish, but I was scared too, for myself in that moment. I brought this poor thing her food and stared down at her at the moment. She barely picked at her utensils and just began scarfing the food down like a ravenous, desperate sort of hunger I'd never seen before. Her eyes welled with tears at the ferocity of her eating, and I could hear her struggle to swallow as if she hadn't eaten in so long she simply forgot how to. She was crying with every bite as she grabbed food from both hands. I could very clearly see a giant purple bruise taking over much of her forearm. I felt such pity in my heart, watching this girl experience their first bout of kindness in God knows how long. All I wanted was for her suffering to end. I made up my mind. I wanted to help. Honey, do you need me to get you some help? I'll drive you anywhere you need to go. I'll call the cops. Say the word, I'll do it. No! The woman's head shot up and stared at me with an incredibly horrified look on her face. No, it's fine. I don't need help. I don't need the cops, don't worry. No one else has to get involved. It's my fault. I did this. Baby, this ain't your fault, I countered. Whoever's chasing you down, whoever's making you this scared, it's their fault. You don't deserve what's happening to you. I was an idiot, the woman exclaimed. I was desperate. I trusted him, I believed him, and now... She choked back tears and hung her head down low, rubbing her eyes furiously. The radio crackling grew louder behind me. Startling her, she gasped loudly and covering her mouth, nearly falling out of her seat. Hey, it's alright, it's just my old radio, I said. No, it's... She was cut off by the buzz of the fluorescent lights above us, flickering wildly with a loud, almost deafening hum. The street lamps outside started flashing so brightly and wildly it looked like the morning sun had barely risen. My head shot to look out the window. That's when I saw it. A figure out in the distance, just passing barely over the horizon. The mere silhouette of a man. Before my eyes could make out any features, all the lights on the street shut off at once, plunging the world outside into complete darkness. The figure disappeared into the shadows of the night. I should have kept going, it's too late! The woman's voice hit a frantic level, nearing a screech. I'm calling the police, I said, desperate at her sudden urgent pleas for me not to. When I picked up my cell phone, it was completely off, almost as if it was dead. The phone beside me didn't even have a dial tone, it was just completely dead. I stared down at the receiver in disbelief. The young woman's sudden words snapped me out of it. Please, you have to hide me. Please, I can't let him get me. Please, ma'am, please. I had no idea what was happening at that moment, but that young girl was scared out of her mind of a man walking down the road. I didn't know what would happen if he found her. Being as frail as she was, there was no way she could protect herself against someone who meant her harm. Without even thinking, I rushed to the kitchen door and opened it, throwing a set of keys at her. Go inside the kitchen and lock it shut. Shut the Persian window and lock that off too. I'll hold him off. The young woman sobbed a quick thank you before rushing past me into the kitchen. I heard that familiar click of the lock. The lights above me still buzzed, each flicker lasting longer than the one before. The radio was now all but static, with not a single voice discernible in it. I grabbed on the counter for no other reason than I felt like I needed to be holding something. And then once, suddenly everything just stopped. The lights firmly, silently held in their glow. The radio returned to the night owl hideaway. The street lamps outside the diner flicked back on and the door opened. For all intents and purposes, a man walked through those doors, but it was a man like none I've ever seen. Standing about 6'7", this tall, splendid man's head barely made it into the doorway. He had jet black hair that grew in patches around an otherwise deformed skull. Some segments of his hair grew long and kept awry, while others lay flat on his head as if meticulously smoothed down with great care. He wore a suit that was completely enveloped his otherwise thin form. One sleeve ran fouled down past his arm. The other stopped at the middle of his left forearm, showcasing his shredded skin underneath. It looked as if someone ran his left arm again and again on a grater, slicing off thick sections of his flesh, leaving the rest flimsy and tattered. His pants had stains all over them and looked as dark as oil and as thick as mud. He wore one loafer, emaciatedly clean and pristine, on his leather coat, a ragged tennis-shoed cake in the same black substance as his pants. But by far, his most notable feature was his face. It didn't seem like it was on right. It looked like as if someone carefully sliced the face off of another man and hastily attached it to this one. It lay crookedly on his lumpy head, tilted unnaturally to the left. The holes were where his eyes needed to go lay uneven, with one perfectly visible and the other half hidden by the matted, rotting flesh. His nose was completely bent at an inhuman angle, and his lips were shut tightly, as if sewn together. I couldn't breathe, let alone speak, when this man walked into my diner. The doors were shut behind him, in a faint ring with the bell on top. His head turned slowly to the left and right, surveying the entire place. His gaze then settled onto me. His form slowly hunkered up to the countertop, his left leg leading the way with great difficulty, and his right leg limped lamely and slowly behind him. His gait was unlike anything I'd ever witnessed in my life. When he took a step, it was as if his entirety, center of gravity, shifted from his waist to his shoulders. He looked like a torn rag doll, slowly moving its way but dragging to the rest of the body. But still, despite all of that, he walked with such a normal speed that it looked like an almost deliberate dance whenever he had moved. With each step, the face attached to his skull shifted and squelched with a horrible sound of flesh, blood, and muscles oozing together. I said nothing when he approached the counter. I was completely petrified in fear, unlike anything I'd ever known. My heart nearly stopped when our eyes met, and I felt the sick mix of bile and water rising in my gut, and the smells of his open flesh meat met my nostrils. "Hello, ma'am," the figure warbled out with a tone that sounded like someone spoke underwater. His lips never moved when he spoke. "I'm looking for a woman, 5'8", long black hair, thin, wearing an off-white dress. She has a brown purse. She was walking this way. Have you seen her?" My lips felt frozen together. When I tried to make a sound, my hands remained unmoving at my sides, as if any slight movement would seal my fate. The man stared unblinkingly at me, patiently awaiting my response. For a moment I considered blurting out, "In the kitchen. She's in the kitchen," just to get him away from me. I was almost terrified to lie to him, but I promised the young girl I'd keep her safe. I cleared my throat nervously and shook my head. "No," was all I could muster out. The man's head tilted slowly to the right, shifting his entire face when he did. I could see underneath the face a mixture of muscle intertwined with black veins. "Are you sure? I saw her come this way. Surely with all the windows, you would have at least seen her walking by," he said, far more eloquent than I would have pictured for someone in his condition. "I was cleaning," I stammered out, gesturing with tiny movements to the collection of menus on the counter shop. "I didn't see nothing." The man didn't speak, but merely continued to stare at me. We stood in a stare-off for at least 5 whole minutes. I was far too terrified to say anything, for fear of what he'd respond with. I think he was waiting for me to break, waiting for me to simply tell him what he wanted to hear. and suddenly he slammed both of his fists onto the countertop. My vision narrowed and everything around me went pitch black. The walls disappeared and the floor vanished from underneath me. I was falling, quickly and ceaselessly falling, into a dark void, screaming out with no voice. The man had disappeared, and far beyond me as I felt the sensation of my gut and organs flying upwards nearly jolted me. It was like my skin and clothes were much heavier than the rest of my internal figures. The void around me was suddenly very hot. Unbearably hot. I felt as if I was being strangled in nothing but a hot abyss, my skin feeling as though it was burning off of my being into a crispy mess. My screams felt like they were baked and stayed lodged in my throat. No sound released, no matter how hard I had fought. I tried, reaching upwards, but my arms were weighed down by the burning flesh. My body slammed with the start on something very hard and very cold. It burned my already burning flesh with the icy pain and complete absolute lack of heat. The cold surface froze my very soul, pinning my body to it. In less than a second, I was absolutely closed into a container. It was pitch black and I couldn't even see my own hand an inch away from my face. And I could feel a surface directly touching my nose, my hands, and my feet. I was closed into something entirely, and I screamed again. But each ragged breath I took sucked the air from the container I was confined to. Every time I screamed, I could feel the air escaping my lungs, and nothing returning inside of them. The air while I was in was entirely limited. I felt myself black out from the lack of oxygen. My brain slowly turning to mush, and the last bit of air left my lips and left me suffocating on nothing at all. Who knows how long I was out for? All I do remember is waking up still confined in that box, with enough air to let me muster out a few throat-ripping screams, before succumbing to the same asphyxiating fate. It felt like this continued on forever. Each time I awoke, I choked and suffocated once more. It felt like weeks, then years. It was like an eternally locked within the confines of darkness. After my eternity of suffocation, I felt a hand grab my shoulder and pull me back to the world. I was outside. There was a large building in front of me, and I had to adjust my eyes to the brightness of the sun, the actual sun once again. The sign in front of me, the road, reading St. Paul's Elementary. My body was jolted by a tiny body clinging to my leg, enveloping me in a tight squeeze. "Bye, Mommy! See you later!" A tiny voice rang. I looked down, and there he was. My son. Zach. With a sinking feeling inside of me, I knew exactly where I was. I could tell by his clothes, that little red shirt with the robot on it, the light blue jeans, the same clothes I had written on countless missing person posters. That was the day I dropped my son off at school and never saw him ever again. This was the day I never again saw the light of my life. This was the day that finalized the end of mine, my husband's marriage. This was the day my life as I knew it ended forever. But Zachary didn't let go of my leg. It was like time froze and he stayed there, hugging me tightly. I couldn't bend down to hug him, though, as much as I wanted to. A warbled voice rang out to me. "Zachary misses you," it said. My head shot up, and there I was, back in the diner. I stood behind the counter, gripping it with my white-knuckled fists, while the tall, inhuman man stood before me. His face nearly slipped off his head, and he quickly turned and looked to the booths of the diner. Zachary was sitting there eating an ice cream sundae and coloring on a kid's menu. His little legs kicked back and forth as he hummed out of tune of his favorite TV show. "Let me reunite you. Let me bring him back to you. I can give you Zachary." The man reached out slowly as if his arm had all but stopped working and extended his shredding hand before me. He looked at me expectantly. I couldn't respond. All I could do was stare at Zach. who looked so blissfully happy eating his treat. I stared at the figure, then down to the hand, my tears streaming down my face. I couldn't control my breathing. It felt like all at once the earth might rip away from my feet again. One look at the skin shredded on that spindly hand, the fear returned to my gut as I was petrified. I saw a glob of black ooze running off his wrists, and I shook my head wildly, retreating my hand back and looking up at him. "No!" I screamed firmly, the first words I had said in centuries. My eyes overflowed with tears as I kept shaking my head. The lights flickered again and the radio stopped. The man staring at me, head tilted before slowly putting back his hand. As his hand returned to his body, Zachary disappeared from the booth. No ice cream, no coloring page, no gentle hum. The man nodded slowly. "And I'm sorry I wasted your time, ma'am. Good night." And then as soon as he had arrived, the man slowly waltzed out the door with his ungracefully limp and his flopping torso. I stood there behind the counter, unable to move. I couldn't speak. I could barely breathe in. My body remained frozen from my hands, firmly gripping at the countertop. The radio cackled out, and lights buzzed. When I looked up at the clock, it was 4:35 a.m. After a long period of silence, I heard a click behind me. The door opened and out came the frail woman, looking at me with such sad eyes. "Thank you," the woman said, choking back a sob. "And I'm sorry you had to get involved." I couldn't find any words to say as I watched her quickly and hurriedly placed the keys on the countertop in front of me and leave through the front door. She turned left and went back the way she came, walking quickly out over the horizon into the night. I watched the back of her go into the distance and beyond, and stared into nothingness of the horizon until the sun came up, and I heard the familiar ring at the door when my coworker arrived at 6 a.m.